The winter had not ended, but it had stopped meaning anything. The fields lay bruised beneath a thin crust of snow. The trees stood like bones, and the wind moved through the empty houses, as if it were searching for the living. The war was over, or so they said, but peace had not arrived, only silence. The kind of silence that clings to walls after fire, the kind that remembers voices it can no longer echo. Roofs sagged beneath the weight of cold chimneys, coughed out the last of the firewood, and in the corners of each room, the smell of damp earth mixed with hunger. People no longer spoke of victory. They spoke only of bread. Somewhere inside that silence lived a woman alone with a child who no longer asked questions. Her hands were cracked, her face hollow from waiting for something she could no longer name. She moved through the house like someone afraid of waking the ghosts. Once there had been laughter in these rooms, but now every sound felt borrowed, like hope owed a debt to despair. Outside, the village road was frozen, stiff, marked only by footprints that led nowhere. The church bell hung still, its heart rusted to silence. That morning a low hum drifted over the horizon, distant, steady, unfamiliar. It did not sound like thunder nor like wind, but something heavy and alive moving closer. She paused, the wooden spoon slipping from her hand, her pulse tightening, with both fear and a strange, impossible hope. For a long moment, she only listened. Then, almost against her will, she whispered into the cold, "Please, let it not be the past returning." The sound came first, low, rhythmic, pulsing through the frozen air, like a heartbeat the earth had forgotten. She stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass, trying to make sense of it. For weeks, the world had been still held in the grip of a silence so heavy it seemed to press against her chest. Now that silence was breaking, trembling, as if something alive had begun to move beneath the snow. The hum grew louder, not menacing, but strange, steady, mechanical. It rolled through the hills and down the narrow road that cut across the valley like a scar. The woman's hands tightened on the window frame. Behind her, the child stirred, asking no questions, but watching her face, as if the truth lived there. The sound did not stop. It multiplied several engines, now overlapping their growl, carrying through the morning fog. Birds startled from the trees, vanishing into the gray sky. Smoke drifted from the chimneys that still worked thin and uncertain. Somewhere, a door slammed, then another. People were waking not from sleep, but from the numbness of waiting too long. The air itself seemed to shiver with anticipation. She pulled her shawl tighter, feeling the small weight of her child's hand find hers. It was cold, small, trembling. "Stay close," she whispered, though he had nowhere else to go. They stepped outside. The road stretched empty, a strip of ice bordered by sagging fences and snowbanks. The noise grew clearer, now engines laboring against the climb, wheels crunching on the frozen ruts. She could smell something faint on the wind, something oily, metallic, foreign. Her neighbors began to appear one by one, as if summoned by instinct. Old men in threadbare coats, women clutching children to their skirts. All of them drawn to the sound that promised change, yet threatened it. At the same time, no one spoke. The whole village seemed to be holding its breath. For years, noise had meant danger, bombers overhead, boots on the cobblestones, orders shouted in a language that froze the blood. Now the same pattern of noise came again, but slower, less sharp, almost human. From behind the far ridge, shapes began to move, dark silhouettes emerging through the fog, growing larger with each turn of the wheels. The woman felt her heart pounding against her ribs. Her first thought was fear. It had to be soldiers. Maybe the front had shifted again. Maybe the war had not truly ended. Maybe it was the old army returning to take what little remained. But then she saw it, not the gray uniforms she remembered, not the sharp helmets and flags, but something unfamiliar, vehicles painted dull green, caked in mud, marked with white stars. A murmur passed through the crowd, soft as wind over dry leaves. No one dared say the word out loud at first. It moved from mouth to mouth, carried in a whisper. Americans. The word sounded strange, heavy, uncertain, like a prayer no one had dared to utter until now. The engine slowed. The first truck appeared at the edge of the square, its tires throwing up slush. Steam hissed from the radiator, and behind the windshield she could see faces, young, pale, wrapped in scarves and helmets. The vehicles stopped in a line, idling. Doors opened, boots hit the ground, and men stepped out into the snow. They looked around, cautious, but not cruel. Their eyes moved over the ruined village, the hollow houses, the thin faces staring back at them. The woman clutched her child's shoulder. The boy stared openly, fascinated. He had never seen anyone like them, strangers with strong voices and strange accents, their movements deliberate but without anger. The villagers remained still, caught between the reflex of hiding and the need to know. Somewhere behind her, someone whispered, "What do they want?" Another voice answered, "It doesn't matter. We have nothing left to take." One of the men lifted his hand, not to threaten, but to greet. The gesture seemed to confuse everyone more than if he'd drawn a weapon. He said something they couldn't understand, his breath visible in the cold. Then another soldier walked to the back of the truck, unlatched the gate, and dropped it open with a heavy thud. Inside were wooden crates stacked neatly. For a moment, no one moved. Then he reached in, pulled one down, and placed it carefully on the ground. On its side were stenciled letters none of them could read. The woman's pulse quickened. Her mind raced through every story she'd ever heard of armies that promised food and brought only fire, of mercy that turned to violence without warning. She took a step back, pulling her son closer. The boy resisted his curiosity stronger than fear. The soldiers talked among themselves, their tone calm, tired, almost kind. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, bent down, lifted the crate's lid and held up a small tin can. He smiled, said a few words, then rolled it gently across the snow toward the villagers. It stopped near the well. The crowd parted slightly, no one daring to move. The child broke first. He slipped from his mother's grasp, ran forward, and picked it up with both hands. The metal was cold against his skin. The label showed a picture he didn't recognize. He turned it over, his eyes wide. The woman's heart leapt to her throat. For a second she expected a shout, a gun, some terrible correction. But none came. The soldier only watched, smiling faintly, his breath fogging in the air. Then something remarkable happened. Another man stepped down from the truck holding a loaf of bread. He broke it in half and placed it on the hood, motioning toward the villagers. A woman near the front began to cry, not loudly, but as if her body had simply remembered how. Others whispered prayers under their breath. The fear did not vanish, but it softened, turned to disbelief, then to something fragile and trembling hope. The woman felt her knees weaken. She didn't step forward, not yet. Her mind refused to trust what her eyes saw. Her son held the tin-like treasure, looking back at her with an unspoken question. She nodded slowly, though she didn't know why. Around them, the villagers began to move, hesitant, inching closer to the trucks. The soldiers spoke gently, gesturing, handing out small packages, crackers, cans, blankets. For the first time in years, the sound that filled the square was not orders or screams, but voices. Broken, confused human voices. A child laughed. Someone said thank you in a trembling accent. The woman found herself crying without realizing it. The tears burned her cheeks, half from the cold, half from something older grief colliding with relief. She wiped them away, roughly ashamed, but the feeling would not leave. The man who had smiled earlier turned his gaze toward her. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. He nodded once, as if to say he understood something she could never explain. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded cloth, dark green, thick, and walked toward her. The crowd parted to let him pass. Her breath caught as he stopped in front of her, holding the cloth out. "Warm," he said softly. His accent was rough but clear. "For you?" She hesitated, then took it. The fabric was heavy and coarse, but it carried warmth instantly. She pressed it to her chest, whispering a word that barely left her lips. He didn't need to understand it. He only smiled, tired and kind, before turning back to the truck. For a long time she stood there, the child clinging to her skirt, the engines humming softly in the background. The sky began to lighten and the fog drifted away, revealing the fields beyond the road, broken, barren, but no longer lifeless. Around her, people moved like shadows, rediscovering form, touching food, holding warmth, relearning what it meant to survive. She looked down at her son. He was still staring at the tin in his hands, tracing the letters with a finger. "What is it?" he asked. Her voice trembled as she answered, "I don't know." But as she spoke, the words felt like something she hadn't dared to say in years. "Maybe it's a beginning." The sound of the engines deepened as more trucks rolled into view, stretching down the road as far as the fog would allow. The air was filled with the scent of oil smoke and something faintly sweet chocolate. Maybe, though no one could quite believe it. The woman wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the fabric holding the ghost of another world. The fear had not left her, not entirely, but it had changed shape. It no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. And for the first time since the war began, she dared to listen. The engines rumbled into stillness, leaving behind an uncanny silence that felt louder than before. The woman stood frozen at the edge of the square, the green blanket still clutched to her chest, its warmth seeping through the chill, but not yet through her fear. The soldiers were everywhere now, moving carefully, voices low, boots pressing into the snow that muffled everything but their presence. They seemed cautious, almost uncertain of what they had stepped into. The villagers, too, held themselves in a half circle, wary, their faces pale and expressionless like ghosts who had been caught staring at the living. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the truck engines cooling in the frost. Smoke curled upward, mixing with breath and fog until the world itself seemed to blur between one life and another. Then one of the soldiers, a young man with a tired face, walked forward, his rifle slung behind his shoulder. His gloved hands were raised slightly, palms open, in a gesture of peace. He said something in English that no one understood, the words soft but confident, as if he were trying to soothe a frightened animal. The villagers flinched anyway. To them, foreign words had always come with commands, not comfort. The man stopped, looked around, then crouched to open another crate. He lifted out a tin, held it up, and gestured toward the crowd. A boy stepped forward instinctively. Her boy, she realized with a jolt of fear, and before she could stop him, he had already taken a few hesitant steps closer. The soldier knelt down, placed the tin on the ground, and backed away, nodding, as if to say it was safe. The child paused, then approached, his small boots crunching in the snow. Every breath the villagers took seemed to hang in the air, waiting for a gunshot that never came. The boy reached the tin, picked it up with both hands, and looked back at his mother for permission. Her lips moved, but no words came out. The soldier smiled faintly, then pointed to the tin and mimed eating. His gesture was awkward, almost shy, but unmistakable. He was offering food. The child hesitated only a second before tucking it beneath his arm and running back to her. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with something she had almost forgotten wonder. She pulled him close, checking him for harm, but there was none. The soldiers hadn't moved. They simply watched, standing in the gray light, like men caught in someone else's memory. One of the older villagers muttered a prayer. Another crossed himself. Slowly the fear began to shift, still there, but lighter now, bending under the weight of confusion. A woman stepped forward, clutching her shawl, and whispered, "Why are they here?" No one answered. The young soldier turned to his companions and spoke quickly. Two others climbed into the truck and began unloading more crates. They stacked them near the well, careful not to startle anyone. The woman noticed how gently they handled each box, as though the wood itself might bruise. One soldier slipped on the ice, cursed softly, then laughed under his breath, a strange warm sound that cut through the tension like a crack in a wall. Laughter. She hadn't heard it in months. It startled her more than any gunfire could have. The child looked up, smiling, without knowing why. Around them, the air felt different, less like the end of something, more like the start of something fragile. Then came the moment of collision. An older man, thin as a scarecrow and still wearing a torn armband of the old regime, shouted something harsh. His voice trembled with both pride and hunger. He demanded they leave, waving his arms as if his words could turn back the tide of history. The soldiers stopped what they were doing. For a second, it was as though time froze again, the fragile peace cracking under the weight of old hate. The young soldier straightened, his expression unreadable. Then he simply nodded, stepped back, and raised his hands again in that same calm gesture. "No fight," he said, slowly pointing to his chest. No guns. The old man's face twisted. He spat into the snow and turned away, shoulders shaking. But no one followed him. Even those who still carried anger in their eyes stayed rooted in place, caught between fear and need. The soldier lowered his hands, exhaled, and motioned to the crate again. "Food," he said, tapping the lid. "For children." The word children carried easily across the language divide. Heads turned. Mothers hesitated, then stepped forward in silence. The woman watched as the line formed, hesitant, broken, but real. The soldiers handed out cans, loaves, small bundles of something wrapped in paper. Each gesture was careful, deliberate, almost reverent. There was no triumph in their faces, no gloating. Only exhaustion, and a quiet understanding that mercy too had its own kind of weight. When her turn came, she did not know whether to look them in the eye or keep her head bowed. The young man handed her a can and a folded piece of cloth, perhaps meant to carry it. She murmured something that might have been gratitude, though the word felt foreign in her mouth. For a heartbeat, their eyes met again. His were blue, clear, but heavy with fatigue. Hers were dark, hollow, still half drowned in suspicion. In that moment neither saw an enemy, only two people who had survived different kinds of hunger. As she stepped back, she felt a tug at her sleeve. Her boy held out his can to show her, beaming, as if he had just found treasure buried in the snow. The sight made her chest tighten. The sound of distant laughter, children laughing, rippled faintly through the square. It was thin, uncertain, but alive. One of the soldiers opened a tin of coffee and poured its contents into a dented pot, setting it on a small burner. The scent drifted through the cold air, rich and warm, stirring memories she had buried years ago. She saw others lift their heads, eyes closing as they breathed it in. A woman whispered, "It smells like before." No one answered. They simply stood there, breathing as if the air itself could feed them. Still, the tension never vanished entirely. The soldiers moved with care, and the villagers kept their distance, as though any sudden motion might break whatever fragile truce existed between them. Every smile was cautious, every word a risk. Yet with each crate that emptied, something invisible began to shift. The young soldier knelt again, this time near her son, holding out a square of something brown. The boy blinked unsure, until the man tore off a corner, ate it himself, and smiled. The boy reached for it and tasted. His eyes widened, and he laughed softly. The woman's throat burned. The soldier said something she couldn't understand, but his tone was gentle, playful. The child answered in nonsense words, and somehow they both laughed. It was clumsy, beautiful, heartbreaking. Around them the village slowly thawed. People were talking now, haltingly, sharing what little they knew or thought they knew. One soldier fixed a broken fence near the well. Another helped an old man lift a bucket of water. It was not charity that filled the air. It was something quieter, older, something that belonged to all who had lost too much. As dusk began to fall, the trucks idled again, ready to move on. The soldiers gathered what was left of their supplies and loaded the crates that remained. The villagers stood watching, unsure what to do, their faces half lit by the fire from a small stove someone had built in the snow. The young soldier approached her once more, gesturing toward the child's tin. "Eat," he said softly, pointing first to the can, then to his own mouth. "Good." She nodded. "Thank you." The words came out rough, her accent thick, but he seemed to understand. He gave a faint smile, tipped his helmet, and stepped back. The engines roared again, echoing through the valley. The trucks began to roll forward, their wheels cutting tracks through the snow. The villagers didn't move until the sound faded into the distance. The woman stood there long after the others had gone, staring down the road. The blanket still hung from her shoulders, its olive color almost blending with the dark. Her boy tugged at her hand. "Will they come back?" he asked. She didn't know the answer. She only squeezed his hand and whispered, "Maybe." Behind them, the square was no longer silent. The people spoke in low voices, some still crying, some laughing softly, all bound by the same bewildering question, what had just happened? The woman looked at the empty space where the trucks had been, then at the tin in her son's hands. Her fear had not disappeared. It lived quietly beneath her ribs, but for the first time, it no longer ruled her. That night, as she tucked her child beneath the heavy blanket, She listened to the wind outside. It still carried the echo of engines, the scent of smoke, and something else, something unfamiliar but tender. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the sound of the world remembering how to breathe again. Days passed, though no one in the village kept count anymore. The Americans had come and gone, leaving behind crates, blankets, and a silence that was no longer empty. The square still smelled faintly of coffee and smoke. The woman who now slept with the olive blanket folded at the edge of her bed found herself listening each morning for the faint hum of engines beyond the hills. She told herself it was foolish, yet the thought came anyway, quiet as breath. Maybe they would return. Maybe it hadn't been a dream. The snow began to soften, turning the roads into streams of gray water. Children dared to step outside again, their laughter echoing against the walls like the first birds after winter. The men repaired fences, the women tried to bake with what little flour remained. Life didn't return all at once. It crept in slowly like warmth returning to a frozen limb. And then one morning the sound came again. Not distant this time, but clear, familiar. The villagers stopped what they were doing. Hammers paused, mid-swing buckets set down in mud. Hearts beat faster, not with fear, but with something harder to name. The trucks appeared at the same curve of the road, rolling in, slow and steady. This time, no one hid. Doors opened before the engine stopped. Children ran forward, shouting greetings in broken English half-words and laughter. The soldiers waved back, smiling, their faces flushed with the cold. The woman stood by her door, her son gripping her hand tightly. She felt the same unease she'd felt before, but it was softer now, an ache, not a wound. The Americans moved as before, unloading crates, setting up small fires, boiling water. A few villagers approached to help, without waiting for permission. Hands, once clenched in fear, now reached out in instinct. The soldiers nodded, surprised but grateful. The woman joined them quietly, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She carried empty baskets and filled them with cans, her eyes meeting theirs more easily this time. When the young soldier, the one with the blue eyes, saw her, he smiled in recognition. "Morning," he said. She didn't understand the word, but she knew the tone. She nodded. Throughout the day, they worked side by side. The soldiers distributed supplies. The villagers organized them into piles. Flour here, milk there, blankets in the church. It was awkward, but there was rhythm in it. A kind of fragile cooperation. The woman noticed how the men handled each item carefully, as if the objects themselves were sacred. Once, when her son stumbled, the young soldier reached out quickly, steadying him by the arm. The boy looked up startled, then grinned. The soldier chuckled softly. It was such a simple thing, yet she felt her chest tighten. By afternoon, the smell of food filled the square. The soldiers had set up a small field stove and were stirring something thick and warm in a pot. Steam rose into the air, carrying the scent of meat and potatoes. The villagers gathered around, cautious but unable to resist. When the soldiers began ladling the stew into bowls, the line formed naturally. No one had given the order. It simply happened, people moving and quiet, understanding. When it was her turn, the soldier handed her a full bowl. "For you and the boy," he said. She held it close, its heat seeping through the tin, almost painful against her skin. Her son blew on the surface, the steam curling around his face. She watched him eat spoon by spoon, his eyes closing with each bite. For the first time in years, she felt what peace might taste like. The soldiers didn't leave that night. They made camp outside the village, their fires glowing like small constellations beyond the fields. The villagers watched from windows and doorways, the flicker of flames reflecting in their eyes. The woman stayed awake long after her son slept, listening to the distant murmur of English voices. There was laughter, the faint sound of a harmonica, a song she didn't recognize but felt anyway. It wasn't the sound of victory or pride. It was homesickness turned into melody. Somehow that made it easier to bear. Over the following weeks, the visits became regular. The soldiers came every few days, sometimes staying an hour, sometimes a whole afternoon. They brought food, medicine, tools. They asked nothing in return. The villagers, once suspicious, began to give what they could, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserved apples, a place by the fire. Words were few, gestures enough. When one soldier lost a glove, A child ran half a mile through the snow to return it. When the baker's oven cracked, the Americans helped repair it with metal plates from their truck. The woman found herself changing in small ways she barely noticed. She no longer hid when they arrived. Her fear had become something gentler, like the memory of pain that no longer controlled her. One afternoon, she brought a small pot of tea to the square, its steam curling in the air. She poured a cup for herself, then hesitated before offering it to the blue-eyed soldier. He looked surprised, then smiled, lifting the cup carefully, as though it were something precious. "Thank you," he said. The words sounded softer than she expected. She didn't answer, but when he took a sip, she smiled back without meaning to. That night she caught her reflection in the window and realized she was standing straighter. The shadows under her eyes hadn't vanished, but her face no longer looked like a ghost's. The boy slept peacefully, now his dreams no longer filled with hunger. Still, not everyone could accept it. A few men muttered about pride, about the humiliation of being fed by the enemy. But their words carried less power than before. Hunger had made everyone honest. The priest said quietly one Sunday, "Kindness is a bridge. God builds from both sides." No one argued. As the snow melted and the river began to move again, the village took on new sounds, hammering, laughter, even singing. The soldiers helped repair the bridge that had collapsed during the bombings. The woman watched them work alongside the men, sweating, joking, covered in mud. Her boy followed them everywhere, learning their gestures, mimicking their words. "Thank you," he said one evening, testing the syllables on his tongue. She smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." One afternoon, the blue-eyed soldier brought her a small notebook and a pencil stub. He pointed to the boy, then to the pages. "For school," he said. She took it, unsure what to say. He shrugged and smiled. "He'll need it." That night she watched her son trace letters on the paper, his tongue peeking out in concentration. The sound of the pencil scratching was like a heartbeat. She couldn't read the words, but she understood the meaning. They were learning how to begin again. There was one moment she would never forget. It happened at dusk, when the sky turned the color of smoke and the air smelled of thawing earth. The soldiers were packing to leave for the night. Her son ran forward, waving the notebook. The soldier bent down laughing, ruffling his hair. Then, for no reason she could explain, she stepped forward too. "Wait," she said, her voice catching. She took off her scarf, thin, worn but clean, and held it out. "For you," she said. The soldier hesitated, then took it gently. "Thank you," he murmured, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Their hands brushed, and she felt a warmth that frightened her, not desire, but recognition. Two survivors of different wars, both tired of being afraid. When the trucks left that evening, their lights glowing through the mist, the woman stood watching until they vanished beyond the trees. Around her, the village was alive, children running fires, burning people talking, softly. She felt something rise in her chest that wasn't sorrow, not quite joy, but something in between. It was hope, cautious and trembling, but real. That night, as the wind moved gently through the cracks of her home, she lay awake listening. She could still hear echoes of the harmonica, faint and far away. Her son stirred in his sleep, murmuring the new words he'd learned. She reached out, tucking the blanket around him. Her hand lingered on his hair, and a tear slid down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the strange, aching peace that comes when fear begins to loosen its grip. Outside, the snow was almost gone. The earth was damp, ready. The war had left its scars, but beneath them something tender had begun to grow again. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, she no longer dreaded tomorrow. She only hoped to meet it gently, with open hands. Spring came uncertainly that year, like a guest unsure if it was welcome. The snow receded into the ditches, and the air filled with the smell of damp soil and wood smoke. The soldiers still came, though not as often now. They were rebuilding bridges farther north, and each visit felt shorter, quieter. Yet their presence lingered in the village. The crates, by the church, the laughter of children, the faint echo of a harmonica played at dusk. The woman had begun to believe cautiously that life might truly move forward. But the past has a way of waiting in silence, patient and cruel. It began with whispers, At first they were small, harmless things talk in the square, at the well, behind closed doors. Some said the Americans were only pretending to help. Others claimed they would soon take the land, the houses, the young men. The old loyalties buried under hunger and fatigue began to stir again. Fear, when starved too long, feeds easily on rumor. The woman tried to ignore it, to hold on to what she had seen with her own eyes, the kindness, the quiet, respect. But even she could feel the air changing. People spoke in half voices, now glancing over their shoulders, as if kindness itself had become dangerous. One afternoon, as the soldiers arrived with a final convoy of supplies, a man stepped forward to meet them. He was tall, lean, his face hollow from illness, but his eyes bright with bitterness. He had once been someone, an officer, a loyalist, a believer in everything that had fallen apart. His name was Kruger. He had been silent for months, tending to his wounds and watching the world rebuild without him. Now he stood in the middle of the square, blocking their way. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp, brittle. "We don't need your pity." The words struck like stones. The villagers froze. The woman felt her heart tighten. The blue-eyed soldier, Ray, she'd learned his name, stopped, his hand still on the side of a crate. He didn't understand the language, but the tone was clear enough. Kruger stepped closer, his boots grinding against the gravel. "You feed us, and we forget who we are," he continued, switching awkwardly into English. "You make us beg. You make us small." Ray's jaw tightened. He looked at the man, then at the villagers, their faces pale and uncertain. No one moved. The air was heavy with shame and confusion. The woman wanted to speak, to tell Kruger he was wrong, but fear held her still. It wasn't the soldiers she feared. It was the way old hate could rise again, even after being buried beneath kindness. Ray finally set the crate down. He took a slow step forward, his voice calm, quiet. "We came to help," he said simply. "That's all." Kruger laughed, a sound sharp and hollow. "Help? You think you can clean this with food? You think kindness makes us forget what you did?" Ray didn't answer. He stood there, breathing through the tension, his gloved hands at his sides. The villagers looked between them, torn. The woman could feel their thoughts. What if he's right? What if mercy is just another kind of control? The silence stretched thin, like a wire, ready to snap. Then Kruger turned to the others, his voice rising. "We were proud once. Now look at us, waiting for handouts like dogs." He kicked over one of the crates. The cans spilled into the mud, rolling across the ground with dull metallic sounds. A child cried out. A woman gasped. Ray flinched but didn't move. Another soldier reached for his weapon, but Ray raised a hand, stopping him. "No," he murmured. He stepped forward again, slow, deliberate, and bent down to pick up one of the fallen cans. He brushed the dirt from it with his thumb and set it back into the crate. His movements were gentle, almost reverent. Then he looked up at Kruger. "You don't have to take it," he said softly, "but someone will." The man's anger faltered. His mouth opened, but no words came. He looked around and saw the faces of his neighbors, the women, the children, the old men. They weren't proud. They were tired. One by one, their eyes dropped to the food in the mud. Kruger's voice broke when he spoke again. "You're making us weak," he whispered. Ray shook his head. "No," he said. "Just human." The words hung there, carried by the wind, sinking into the quiet. Kruger stared at him, his shoulders trembling, then turned away. He didn't shout again. He just walked, his steps uneven, his shadow stretching long across the snow. No one followed him. The woman felt something in her chest loosen, though her eyes burned. She went to her knees beside the spilled food, picking it up piece by piece. The others joined her, silent. Even the soldiers knelt to help, saying nothing. It was not submission, it was survival, dignity, built from action instead of pride. When the work was done, Ray straightened and looked at her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her voice failed her. He gave a small nod in return. "He's angry," he said quietly, "but maybe not forever." That evening, the square was quieter than usual. The villagers ate in their homes, the fires glowing behind shuttered windows. No one spoke of what had happened. Yet under the hush there was something new, an understanding that kindness, like faith, was fragile and had to be protected. The woman sat by the fire, her son asleep beside her. The blanket, the one Ray had given her that first day, hung on the chair. She reached for it, fingers tracing the rough weave. She remembered Kruger's face, the bitterness in his voice. She thought of Ray kneeling in the mud without anger, his hands steady, his eyes patient. She wondered what it meant to forgive, to offer without needing thanks. Was that what peace truly looked like? Not triumph, not relief, but a quiet endurance. Outside, the night was restless. The wind pressed against the walls, carrying faint echoes from the past. Boots on stone, the roar of orders, the cries of men. She closed her eyes, listening, then opened them again. Those sounds were fading, now replaced by something gentler. The distant murmur of laughter from the soldiers' camp, the hiss of snow melting on warm coals. The next morning she saw Kruger again. He was by the wellhead, bowed, shoulders slumped. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something hollow. She hesitated before approaching. When he looked up, his eyes were red, not from rage, but from exhaustion. "You think they'll forgive us?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Maybe it's not about forgiveness," she said. "Maybe it's about starting anyway." He said nothing. But when the next convoy came a week later, he was there helping to unload. No one mentioned it. No one needed to. By then, the soldiers had begun building a small wooden bridge over the stream, the same one that had once marked the line between the occupied zone and the rest of the valley. The villagers joined them side by side, carrying planks, hammering nails, wiping sweat from their brows. It was not ceremony or apology. It was something simpler, purer. Each strike of the hammer was a kind of prayer, a promise that rebuilding could exist beside regret. At dusk, when the bridge was done, the villagers stood on one side and the soldiers on the other. No speeches were made. The boy ran first, crossing the planks barefoot, laughing. Others followed. The woman stood at the center of the bridge, her shawl fluttering in the wind, and looked across at Ray. He smiled faintly, raising a hand. She returned the gesture. The sun dipped behind the hills, turning the water below to gold. The bridge creaked softly under the weight of so many footsteps, but it held. For the first time she believed the world might hold too. That night, when the village settled into quiet again, she sat by her window and watched the moon rise over the half-rebuilt roofs. There was no triumph in her heart, only a steady, fragile calm. She whispered into the darkness, not sure who might hear. "Thank you," she said, "for staying kind when it was hardest." And somewhere beyond the trees, the wind carried her words away, not lost, but answered by silence, the kind that no longer frightened her. By summer, the valley no longer looked like the grave it once was. Grass pushed through the cracks in the cobblestones. Wildflowers sprouted along the road where tanks had once passed, and the air no longer smelled of ash, but of rain and tilled earth. The war felt distant now, not forgotten, but quieter, like a shadow that no longer covered the whole sky. The soldiers came less frequently, their convoys moving farther north, leaving behind supplies, tools, and something deeper, an imprint of decency that the villagers didn't quite know how to name. Life had begun to mend itself in small, careful ways. The woman woke early each day, long before the church bell rang again. She baked bread in a new oven built by her neighbors and carried loaves to the well where others gathered. Her hands, once raw from cold and fear, were strong again, dusted with flour instead of dirt. Her son, taller, now ran barefoot through the fields, carrying his little notebook from the American soldier wherever he went. The pages were smudged and filled with crooked words, but they meant more to her than any prayer. Kruger worked beside the others now. His pride had burned down to embers, replaced by something quieter, humbler. He spoke little, and when he did, it was often to the children, showing them how to repair tools, how to listen for the river beneath the soil to find clean water. No one mentioned his outburst that day, in the square. It belonged to another time. The blue-eyed soldier Ray returned once more before the summer harvest. His uniform looked more worn than before his face, older, though not by years. He carried a small wooden box and a folded letter. The villagers gathered instinctively as his truck rolled into the square, not out of fear, but of memory. The woman stood at the front, her shawl fluttering in the warm wind. When their eyes met, she felt that same quiet tremor in her chest. The one that always came when kindness arrived unannounced. Ray smiled a little uncertainly, then reached into the box and pulled out a packet wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to her. "From home," he said softly. She opened it with careful fingers. Inside were bars of soap, a comb, a small photograph of a woman standing beside a porch, and a note written in careful German by someone who must have translated it for him. "The war is over. Build again. Teach your children to be kinder than we were." Her breath caught. She read it twice, then pressed it to her chest. She didn't know what to say, only that her silence said, "Enough." Ray nodded, eyes downcast, as if embarrassed by the weight of it. Then he said almost to himself, "My mother wanted you to have it." The villagers began to help unload the truck. Laughter rippled through the crowd as they discovered pencils, bandages, even toys carved from soft wood. The children's laughter was no longer brittle. It sounded full, alive. For a brief moment, the square felt like the heart of a world reborn. That evening, when the soldiers stayed for supper, they sat around long wooden tables the villagers had built from scavenged timber. There was bread soup, even wine thin but enough. Ray sat across from her, the lamplight flickering between them. The boy leaned against his mother's shoulder, drowsy with food. "He's grown," Ray said quietly. She smiled, touching her son's hair. "Yes, he learns words faster than I can keep up." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the kind that needs no translation. Around them, others were talking softly, sharing food, sharing stories, laughter blending with the crackle of fire. When Ray reached into his pocket, he pulled out something wrapped in cloth, a piece of bread, dry and small. "My mother sent this last year," he said. "Told me to give it to someone who might need it more." He placed it on the table between them. "It's not much, but it's the same bread, isn't it?" She looked at it, then at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "It's the same." She didn't cry, but her throat ached with something beyond words. She broke the bread in half and handed him a piece. He hesitated, then accepted it. For a long moment they ate in silence, two people who had survived opposite sides of the same hunger. When dawn came, the soldiers prepared to leave again. The boy ran after Ray, holding up his notebook. "You forgot," he called, breathless. Ray turned laughing and knelt down. "No, you keep it," he said, closing the boy's hands around it. "Write something good in it, okay?" The boy nodded solemnly. The woman stood a few paces away, her eyes never leaving them. Ray rose, his boots muddy, his hands empty now. "Take care," he said. She answered softly, "And you." It was the only farewell that made sense. The trucks disappeared down the road, engines fading into the trees. The villagers stood for a while, waving until they were gone, then returned to their fields, their homes, their unfinished lives. The woman lingered. In her hands she still held the letter, the one with the line she couldn't stop reading. "Teach your children to be kinder than we were." Weeks passed. The summer ripened into gold. Crops swayed where mines once lay hidden. The river ran clear again. Children played in its shallows, shouting words that no longer belonged to fear. Every Sunday the church bell rang, hesitant at first, then stronger, its voice returned to purpose. The woman began to teach reading to the village children, using the notebook her son had nearly filled. She drew letters on scraps of paper, guiding their hands gently. "This one means home," she would say, and they would smile, as if they understood more than the word itself. Sometimes she would climb the hill overlooking the valley, the same place she had stood that first day when the engines came. From there she could see everything, the new bridge glinting in sunlight, the fields green and heavy with promise, the road winding into the forest like a silver thread. She would close her eyes and listen. The wind still carried echoes, laughter, footsteps, the distant hum of trucks long gone. But beneath it all was the sound of life, steady breathing, forgiving. Kruger often joined her there, sitting in silence. He had aged years and months, but his voice had softened. "You think they'll remember us?" he asked once. She smiled faintly. "Maybe not us, but maybe what we learned." And what was that? That mercy doesn't belong to the winners. He said nothing after that. They watched the horizon until the light turned amber, and then she rose, brushing dust from her skirt. "Come," she said. There's work to do. As autumn approached, she began to bake again, not just for herself or her son, but for others. Every Sunday, she left a small loaf by the chapel door with a note tucked underneath, written in her son's careful handwriting. It said only one word: for anyone. No one ever spoke about it, but every week, the loaf was gone. The valley changed, but the scars remained, walls pocked with bullet holes, fields still uneven, graves scattered at the edge of the forest, yet none of it felt hopeless anymore. The scars were not erasures, but reminders, proof that something had been survived. One evening, as the last light faded, she found her son sitting by the window, the old blanket folded beside him. He was tracing letters on the notebook's final page. When she asked what he was writing, he smiled. "A story," he said, "about when the enemies brought bread." She paused, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. "And how does it end?" she asked. He looked up, eyes bright. "It doesn't," he said simply. "It keeps going." Outside, the first leaves began to fall. The wind that swept through the valley was cool, clean, carrying with it the scent of wheat, wood smoke, and something softer, something that might have been peace. She went to the door, holding the letter close, and whispered into the fading light, "We will be kinder." Then she smiled, the kind of smile born not from happiness, but from understanding. In that moment, as dusk settled over the village, the world felt fragile, mended, and alive again. Even years later, when the valley no longer smelled of smoke but of rain and wild grass, the memory of that winter never faded. It lived quietly in the rhythm of the days, the creak of the church bell, the laughter of children, the way the bread was shared without question. The woman had grown older, her hair streaked with silver, her hands lined from work and time, yet every time she kneaded the dough, she remembered the faces of the strangers who had come not with guns, but with food. Their kindness had reached deeper than any weapon ever could. It had rebuilt something invisible, something that had been shattered long before the first bomb fell trust. Her son grew up to teach others how to read and write, carrying forward the notebook once given to him by a soldier with blue eyes. When he told the story of that winter, he never used the words victory or defeat. He called it the winter of mercy, and the children who listened often asked if it was true. He always smiled and said, "Yes," because sometimes the enemy feeds you, and in doing so makes you human again. The woman often walked to the bridge at sunset, where the planks creaked softly beneath her feet. She would look toward the road where the trucks had vanished and feel the wind touch her hair like a gentle hand. The world had moved on, but the lesson remained quiet, as the evening light that peace is not something granted by power, but something grown through simple acts of compassion. And as the sun slipped behind the hills, she whispered the words she had carried all her life, softly, for no one but the wind to hear. "Be kind, even when it hurts. That's how the world begins again."